Yeah, look, having the earlier panel was quite interesting, and I think the key thing that came out, which definitely resonates, was the ability to unlock the data and unlock the insights. That is pretty profound, not only for people who own data and are sitting on data, but even customers or an end consumer of data, and these challenges could face a really large bank, for example. So, we will often have conversations with very large corporates about helping them grow or helping them manage cash better. They get the pitch, but they are hamstrung by be it systems, processes, for them to be able to consume that and actually get value from that. So this notion of unlocking or turning the data into actual valuable insight, I think, is probably the biggest challenge in my mind that's facing the market. Whether you are a consumer of data, provider of data, or somewhere in the middle, I think that's probably a material challenge in the market.
So I guess what I want to start with is what characterizes research environments is essentially their open nature. So through the impetus to publish, of course, research environments encourage openness, and that sort of it basically conflicts in some ways, you might think, with commercializing opportunities. However, and that's sort of common across all research organizations. But in fact, I'm not so sure that that's the case, and I wanted to talk about an early experience that I had. In my very early career, I was a research scientist. I was a computer scientist with Bell Northern Research, which was Canada's premier research organization in telecommunications. We were both private and publicly funded. We invented the first digital switch. We were competing in the global market. We wanted to penetrate markets throughout the world, and particularly the US market. And I think the story that I'm about to tell is that certain players would like that openness to exist and for that data to be transparent, because it opens up so many opportunities. And for us at that stage, my early role was as a scientist to look at the relationship between the management systems that controlled the network as well as the network. And both of those in the US, both of those industries essentially were owned by AT&T. So Lucent, as it was then known, was merged with AT&T, both the operating company and the equipment supplier. And because they owned both parts of that network, those interfaces were private, and we could never penetrate the US market very effectively, because we were always stopped by the fact that we didn't work with their billing system or that we didn't work with their network management system. And so my job was to essentially understand that environment, and the proposal and the movement that I led was to open that environment up. We talked a lot, Vicky talked a lot about the opportunities for open networks. And what that did was not only allow us to compete on common ground, but a whole bunch of players enter that market and create an incredibly dynamic network that we're all talking about as the platform for the next generation of innovation. So we were able to define open languages that allowed players to come in and create services dynamically, route traffic dynamically, maintain faults in the network proactively and dynamically, instead of waiting 6-12 weeks for a new service to be implemented. And imagine if you could then carry that same environment. It was essentially the first Internet of Things, was the network, the telecommunications network. And imagine if you could take that kind of openness and apply it to our road system today. So I was speaking to a founder of a startup who was working with our researchers in Wollongong recently, and she's looking at making sure that the smart city network is an open network, because in Australia we have not yet opened up that network. And so we're the 21st, listening to the ABC the other day, we're the 21st most congested city in the world. And yet cities like London and Stockholm are addressing those problems by remotely managing the traffic, understanding how to manage the congestion points, and rerouting traffic and charging at different rates and so on, to make cities much more efficient. So it's an example of how research data can be applied in very innovative ways to create all sorts of opportunities. we spoke a little bit about, and I guess I was just going to say the other thing is the challenge for research, particularly, let's just say in CSIRO and data researchers, is languaging around that. So we invented a new language. It was very hierarchical. It was before natural language processing. It was before complex network languages. And so essentially whatever we said could happen within the network was predefined. Whereas I think the challenge now is to be open enough to allow innovation at any place in the network to use the data in innovative ways, but not predefine it so much that new innovation can't take place. Having said that, I think a lot of data is actually quite simple, and it's in, as you said, Moses, the way that it's used that is the innovative thing. And a couple of research projects come to my mind immediately at UOW. The first one is there's a wonderful project called Peta Jakarta. It's not a commercial opportunity yet, but what our researchers are doing is working with the city of Jakarta and looking at Twitter feeds, and they've also worked with Twitter, so they were one of the first people to get, first research groups to work with Twitter, to use tweets around floods, and those tweets will allow Jakarta to proactively manage flood areas using data that all of the members of the city carry around and tweet about in a very proactive way. So eventually the team wants to commercialize that. A couple of other startups that come to mind. A really curious one that we're working with is a company that's actually been in existence for some time. They supply hospital taps to, they supply taps, faucets, water taps to hospitals. They're reinventing themselves and working with our researchers to try and address hospital-acquired infections, which is a huge problem. And the commercial impact is extreme because those people who come into hospital for one operation end up staying 10 times as long if they get an infection. And those infections are quite commonly carried by the water in the system. So they're using the researchers that we have in our university around sensor technology, around developing algorithms to understand water flow, water temperature, but also our chemical researchers looking at how to disperse infection inside the water itself. So those are just two examples. One of our other startups is called Win-Win Parenting, and they're taking open data, which is research about how do you parent effectively. She's a researcher herself. She happens to be at UNSW as a lecturer there, but she's using her background in education research to curate all of this information around how do you parent effectively, and then selling that as a program, as an education program to corporates, and managing essentially downtime for employees based on not being able to effectively parent. So they're sort of very, very different examples. Roz Harvey is the co-founder of The Yield, which is looking at research coming out of oyster farms and remotely monitoring oyster farms and the quality of water to prevent oyster farms from having to close under certain conditions where water quality is going to destroy their oyster farm. We have another startup called Yesterday's Stories. She's a historian, and she's looking at stories that are peppered throughout Wollongong and allowing those stories to be accessed by anyone walking through the city at any one time. So if you're standing in front of a historical building, you get the story about that historical building essentially curated in a video format as you walk through the city. So you can go on and on and on. They're very, very diverse examples of how data can be used, both research data and married to the most mundane data, and provide really innovative opportunities.
Look, I think there is a growing awareness and acceptance of more open data. So, just sort of in line with some of Tim's comments, I don't think we'll ever get to a world where it's, the floodgates are open and knock yourselves out. There are certain pieces of information that individuals want to keep private. And, we've got to respect that as a community and have the right regulation frameworks in place around that, and I do strongly believe there are ways to work around that, and simple things like clearly defined permitted use, de-identification, creating unique IDs. It's bizarre in Australia that a person doesn't have a unique ID, and it can solve some of these sort of problems that concern people around that. But the market be it mums and dads or corporates, are more open to an open data concept. Next week, I'm going to see one of the major banks, and they're interested in our views on what data sets they have that they could open up for them to do better, but to engage in a broader ecosystem. I mean, you would have never thought, particularly this bank, would consider something like that. So
it's the RBA, is it?
It just goes to show, we are in a very different world than even 3 years ago, to be honest. It's not to say to lay down misère, it's not to say it's easy to solve for, but I think, with disruption brings, just a new way of looking things and, a new way to solve for problems. So there is a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of opportunity.
I'd say probably two very simple things. One, I reflect back on, again, with the telecommunications story, and back to, I guess the point was made, how technology radically changed your view of what's normal. When I was working on these problems in the telecommunications world in the 80s, displaying your name was, in the US, illegal for a telephone company to display the name of the caller when the caller called. Now, it was the telephone company's decision to do that, but along comes mobile networks and more intelligence in the handset, and it's just such a normal thing. It's as simple as that has become so normal. But I guess really with my university hat on, and being the director of innovation, I would be saying that, unfortunately, I think universities, whilst they publish their data and they publish their research, they publish it in a form that is very hard for the layperson to understand, and yet there's so much knowledge that's being accumulated and funded. And so I'm very much for opening that data up and making it more accessible and more valuable to society and more well understood. And actually using it for solving some of these very complex problems that we as a very complex society are now facing in terms of the environment and water and so on.
And look, so when people say open data and, the concept of opening data, I think, and for the purpose of monetisation, I think, a couple of things. So I'd be gobsmacked to find any business that didn't sit on data that was valuable. So point one. Point two, I think the priority should be for a business to open up data to itself first, because to Tim's point, most businesses will know lots about their own customers and what they're doing, and no matter how simple that business may be. So open up the data yourself, and then if there's a broader market, broader ecosystem, that's then going to the next step. But that introduces other challenges and so forth. So it's fair to say, so Vita is a data business, for those of you who don't know. So we make money by ultimately selling data to small businesses, to mums and dads and so forth. So are we working with startups? Yes. Early days, I'd say, probably less than 12 months. We're conscious that our proposition could get disrupted in this sort of new big fintech world, and our bread and butter market is around financial services, credit information. Some of that's regulated, so it's a very defined data set. We buy some data, we have some IP that sits on top of it. So obviously the data universe is growing materially. We believe we can connect the dots across different data sets better than anyone else. So, working with startups is important for us to not only broaden our offerings, but to ensure we stay relevant and we don't get disintermediated. So, look, it's early days for us. Data Exchange were on here, Data Republic were on here earlier. That's an example of some early stage conversations, and others. Obviously, being a mature business ourselves, we're learning about how to work with a startup. It's not easy. You know, we've grown as a business by buying actually lots of startups, probably later in this cycle. So we also have an appreciation of. We're not going into this totally naive, but it's definitely a learning journey. Very positive commitment from the top, from our local CEO, and you know, we've put some money into you know, being one of the founding members of, you know, Stone and Chalk. So we actually put some cash behind it as a way to sort of, you know, crawl before we walk, and then maybe we'll get to running at some stage.
Nice.
Well, of course, we work with lots and lots of startups. I think we've supported over 60 or so now, Dion. Yeah. Yeah, so I've lots and lots of experience with them. But I might take quite a relevant example. On Jeremy's chart, you would have seen perhaps the logo of Critical Arc. And I guess my point is, don't assume that a startup, just because they're a startup, is at all naive about data. The two founders are UOW alumni. They have had years of experience working for Honeywell Bull in the security environment. They were responsible for the London Olympics, and they took that knowledge and they said they could solve a security problem better than any other app on the market. And what they did was work very closely with the university, in fact, to develop a campus security system that used not the university's data, because we don't own the students or we don't employ the students, but used student data that is captured in their phone and on the system, on the app, that supports the Critical Arc application, which is called Safe Zone. And it provides instantaneous data if ever there should be a security instance on campus that allows what is effectively a very thin on the ground security team across a very broad geographical area to respond instantaneously and proactively, and to determine whether that's a safety incident or it could be a health incident. Somebody might have broken their leg, or it might have been another incident. And so they've used data in a very effective way and used a very proprietary system of getting that data instantaneously back to our campus security team to respond very well. And the valuation of that company is 15 million now, and when they came into Accelerate, they were worth nothing. So they're very, very sophisticated founders themselves. They understand security, and they've managed that very well, just as you were kind of implying that Quantium was a startup itself.